Thanks for tuning in. In this video, I want to talk about whether chicken is clean or unclean. I have a much longer video where I go into excruciating detail about the unclean birds lists, which are given in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. You can check that out. The link is in the description box if you're interested. But in this video, I just wanted to focus on what I would consider to be the key points on this issue, especially with regard to chicken. So for a little bit of background, whenever I first started getting into observing the Torah and trying to study the commands, I just recognized at the beginning that there was this consensus that chicken was clean. And I didn't really look into it much beyond that because I was looking into other things as well, and I didn't even see any claim otherwise until several years later. Whenever I came across that several years later, I met someone and she suggested that maybe chicken was unclean as I understood. And so at that point, I recognized that I haven't really looked into this issue in detail, and I decided that I'm not sure. And at that point I decided I would not eat chicken or eggs until I had concluded that either chicken was clean or chicken was unclean, and of course if chicken was unclean then I was just going to continue not eating it. So I figured that I'd be able to look into this and figure things out fairly soon, but it ended up taking several years of research off and on before I came to any real conclusions on this subject. So one thing to recognize about the issue of clean and unclean, and first of all, clean and unclean being part of the dietary laws of the written Torah. Most people are aware of clean and unclean. There are also a few others in the written Torah, things like not eating the blood and not eating the fat, or as I would understand it, the tallow, even of certain clean animals, and a few others. So there's that, and there's the clean and unclean issue. And with regard to an animal being clean or unclean, it is different from how we determine an object to be clean or unclean and how we determine a person or a human to be clean or unclean. It's a different matter. Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14 discuss the issue of clean and unclean animals, and generally what we're looking at is criteria to determine whether a type of animal is clean or unclean. So for example, with regard to aquatic life, we're looking for kind of a checklist. We're looking at criteria of fins and scales. Does the animal have both fins and scales, or rather is it a type of animal that has both fins and scales? If so, that species is clean. If not, that species is unclean. So with regard to that, with regard to some of the other types of animals, we're looking at criteria. We're looking at this checklist. When discerning whether a bird or a flying animal is clean or unclean, it is different. Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14 do not give us criteria. It does not say, look at its foot, look at what it eats, is it a type of scavenger, is it a type of predator, etc. We don't see any of those criteria given in the law. And it's not, from my perspective, from a lack of vocabulary. Very easily those things could have been said if that is what God intended. If Elohim wanted us to decide whether a bird was clean or unclean based upon what it ate, then easily that could have been what was commanded in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14, but it's not. Instead, birds are different. Flying things are different from the rest of the animals. We are determining whether they are clean or unclean based upon the list, the unclean birds lists of Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. So essentially it should be fairly simple. If we have a given bird and we want to know whether it's clean or unclean, we should just be able to look at this list and see, is that bird in the list? Are any of these names in the list referring to that bird? And if not, then it's not an unclean bird because it's not in the unclean birds list, therefore it is clean. So with regard to chicken, it should just be as simple as looking at the list and seeing, are any of these birds chicken? Are any of them referring to chicken? If not, chicken is clean. It should be that simple. But here's where the complexity comes in, because being thousands of years from the point in time when the Torah was given, there has been some confusion about what each individual bird in the list is referring to. And this is not a unique conclusion that I've come to. There are a lot of people that have said that even thousands of years ago or 1,000 years ago, saying that we don't know exactly what each of these birds are. And so whenever I was doing my research, my initial angle on this subject was that I'm going to go through the list, I'm going to research each individual bird in the list, and at the end I will know what each bird is, therefore I will know whether chicken is in the list, therefore knowing whether chicken is clean or unclean. In going through the list, I essentially came to different categories of conclusions about the individual birds. So with some of the birds, it was pretty clear that it was a certain bird. There was a pretty clear identification of that bird and pretty decisive evidence, in my opinion. With some of the others, there was this general consensus based upon the evidence and based upon the tradition and so forth. There was good evidence supporting that it was a general type of bird, for example, like some type of kite or some type of buzzard, but there was uncertainty as to what exact kite or buzzard it was referring to. So we didn't know whether it was the black kite or the yellow kite or the red kite or the honey buzzard or something like that. There would be a debate as to exactly which species. But I recognized with those that there was still this agreement that it was a type of kite, that the evidence pointed toward that type of bird. And eventually I narrowed this list down to about 4 or 5 birds that there was less certainty about. So for example, there's one bird that the name is debated as to whether it refers to a type of owl or whether it refers to the ostrich. And there's another example where there's this agreement that it's some type of bird that hunts in the water, that's a fishing bird, but there's a debate as to whether it's the cormorant or whether it's the osprey or something else, a fish owl, etc. So around this time I started getting kind of frustrated because I felt like I had come so far in my research and there were these competing assertions and it wasn't exactly clear what each of these last 5 birds were essentially. And so I wasn't really sure how to approach it, and at that point I had kind of a mindset shift because I realized that my ultimate goal in doing this research, at least from the most practical sense, was to determine whether chicken was clean or chicken was unclean. And so I turned my attention toward that angle in looking at the evidence from that perspective. And I wanted to mention 2 bits of information that I came across in looking at it. So one thing was with regard to the word Tinshemeth. This is the name of one of the birds given in the list, and I came across in my research there was a claim that this bird has a tradition of being the guinea. And I looked into this and I couldn't find any reference to that claim anywhere else. I thought that if this is true, then this may be an issue of concern, that this may relate to the issue of chicken, but I could find nothing that could corroborate it. And the resource said that it was a Samaritan tradition, and so I contacted the Samaritans, and they had a completely different perspective on it. They said nothing about this supposed tradition. So I could find nothing that backed this up, even as a claim. Not only no evidence, but no support of that even being a claim that existed. And so I didn't regard that because there was also a general consensus that this bird was some type of owl, maybe the barn owl. The other piece of information I wanted to mention that may relate to chicken was with regard to Dukey Foth. I found a reference that some historic group thought maybe that bird was the chicken. And essentially the debate appeared to center around interpreting a translation of Dukey Foth rather than actually translating the Hebrew. And there was a debate over maybe it refers to what they understood as mountain woodpecker, and maybe that refers to this type of pheasant. And I thought that, well, if there's evidence to support that, then maybe that would be an issue. But in looking into it, it appeared to be thoroughly debunked. Not only was that a misinterpretation of the translation, but the ultimate point that's relevant to us is what the Hebrew says. The translation of the Hebrew is not really what's important. It's important what the Hebrew itself is referring to. And there is strong evidence, strong consensus, and support of Dukifoth referring to the hoopoe, not referring to some type of pheasant or any other bird, that instead it refers to the hoopoe. There wasn't any actual evidence to back up that other assertion. So after acknowledging all of that, I came to the recognition that there wasn't any good evidence pointing toward chicken being in the list. There wasn't any evidence at all from what I could find. And in fact, all of the evidence pointed away from chicken being unclean. That there was evidence supporting other birds being identified in the list, but there wasn't any evidence supporting chicken being in the list. And by default, if chicken is not named in the list, if the birds in the list do not include chicken, then automatically that means chicken is clean. Because this is how we determine in the written Torah whether chicken or whether any bird is clean or unclean. We would be looking at the list, seeing the names given in the list, and seeing whether, in this case, chicken falls under one of the names in the list. And I see no evidence to support that. In fact, all of the evidence points toward chicken being clean from all that I have seen. I invite everyone to look into this on your own, and if you come to a similar conclusion as I have, I recommend that you get chickens.